Hi everybody, it's Chris Kandai here and welcome to another edition of FAQ, Faith and Quarantine. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe, it really helps us. Leave us a comment if you're enjoying this or share it with a friend. And if you're watching on Facebook, hey, good to see you. Again, like and share and give us some comments. Let us know where you'd like us to go next in the series. For the past few days, we've been looking at the idea of leadership in lockdown. And it's challenging, isn't it? How do we lead ourselves, our families, our workplaces? If you're involved with the church, how do we lead those in a way that's going to be honouring to God and helpful to other people? What are the pressures that leaders are facing, particularly at this time? I'm someone who's trying to help lead in a local church. I'm trying to help lead in my home. I'm trying to help lead in my workplace. And it can feel we're doing all of those things not quite as well as we want to. And so I thought we'd spend some time digging into that and looking particularly at the stories of Samuel, Saul and David. And today it's quite a tough one. I like these to be upbeat and encouraging. I hope we're going to find some encouragement here. But I've called this one How to Fail as a Leader. Again, might be something I feel particularly good at the moment. But I wanted us to look at a difficult leadership situation to see what we can learn and whether it might help us to course correct into these difficult days. So we're going to look at the end of Saul's leadership, and we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 15. If you've been tracking with me over the past few days, you know we've been following the early stages of this story, and it comes to kind of a climactic moment right now. And I think there are nuggets of truth that we can helpfully build into our own leadership as a result. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to this message from the Lord. There's a bit of underlining of the history. Saul is being reminded that the only reason he's king is because God chose Samuel to anoint him. Anointing was like a coronation. We've been saying over the last few days, you fill up a horn with oil and you pour it out on the person, symbolizing their dedication to God. This is what the Lord Almighty says. So he's been given really clear instructions, and Samuel is summoning all of his authority to drive this message through. It's almost as if he expects Saul not to listen very well, and so he's deliberately trying to make sure he's got his attention. This is what the Lord Almighty says. That's an interesting description of God, isn't it? Saul is the leader of Israel. He's got a mighty army, but it is the Lord that is almighty, not Saul. So remember where your power comes from, leaders. As soon as we lose sight of that, that's when danger hits. And we're going to see that in a minute. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Verse 3. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. This is tough, because God commands Saul to lead his people into wiping out the Amalekites completely. It feels like a form of genocide. If that is a question that you've got, two responses. One, ask it to me so then I'll know I ought to answer it. And secondly, I wrote a book called Paradoxology. It's got a whole chapter of God and genocide. So we're not going to deal with that here, but ask me if it really is bothering you. Do not spare them, put to death men and women and children and infants, cattle and sheep and camels and donkeys. Everything gets wiped out. It's like God's patience with the Amalekites has reached its elastic limit, and now it's coming. Now coming is judgment. So Saul, verse 4, so Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men from Judah, Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, go away, leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. So there's mercy here. This is not an indiscriminate massacre. This is a very laser-focused judgment. Again, some people are saying coronavirus is a judgment against God on specific nations who have turned away from him, changed their laws on all sorts of issues. No, coronavirus is a scattergun kind of pandemic. It affects all sorts of people, and it doesn't seem to care which country that you live in. So this is not, I don't think this is the judgment from God specifically for any sins of any nation at this time. And so this is why this kind of judgment sounds really different. This is laser focused in the Old Testament. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur to the east of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. They have done two things wrong. They've spared Agag, the king. Why did they spare the king? Surely the king is the most responsible person, and if anyone ought to be punished, it ought to be him. Maybe there was some sort of, empathy that Saul had. He's a king. He doesn't want to punish another king. Maybe it was a way of kind of trying to be nice, or maybe it was just kind of serving himself. And they take out all the good animals and refuse to kill them, because they think they could do something good for themselves. Greed has kind of come into this moment. Early in the morning, then verse 10, then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I am grieved that I made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and not carried out my instructions. Okay, super interesting bit of insight here. God is grieved. God feels upset or regret at what he's done. This is difficult, isn't it? Because it seems like God has changed his mind. He feels like he's made a mistake. I don't think that's what's going on here. We believe that God is outside of time. He sees the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning from the end, and therefore God doesn't travel through time in the same way that we do. God is outside of time. He can see everything at once, and therefore that's complicated for us to have a relationship with God, isn't it? And so he uses language sometimes to kind of come down to our level, like a dad might do with a baby. Like, it starts speaking gurgly, goo goo gaga language. Why? Because you want to find a way of connecting at the level the baby can understand. And I think that's what God is doing here when he says he regrets installing Saul as king. He's walking Israel through a kind of learning opportunity. God doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't regret things, but he can show Israel as they're going through this difficult time. They asked for the king. God relented and let them have a king. The king then lets them down. God's kind of not saying, see, I told you so, but he is identifying with the kind of emotional life of his people. So go back again, verse 10. And 11, I am grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was troubled and he cried out to the Lord all night. That's interesting. Remember, Samuel was swapped out for King Saul. Samuel was the leader of God's people, and then the people wanted a king. And so they were rejecting Samuel's leadership, and they asked for Saul or some king in place. Now, it hasn't worked. And because it hasn't worked, Samuel could be going, well, I told you so. And he could enjoy this moment because it makes him look better. But that's not the kind of leader Samuel was. It wasn't all about him and his glory and his honor and his reputation. Samuel seemed to genuinely care about two things. One is pleasing God, and second is the needs and welfare of God's people. That's a great leader. Someone who's not always just worried about their own reputation, but someone who's worried about and concerned about God's desires, but also concerned about the needs of God's people. And that's why Samuel cries and prays to God and asks for mercy and help for God's people. Verse 12, early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on to Gilgal. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, the Lord bless you, I've carried out the Lord's instructions. Total lie, but he's covering. But Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? That's a classic line. I remember when my wife and I used to live in Albania, and we had a pet dog, and we just found it on the street one day. Long story, we just made a decision not to have a pet dog, and then there was a screech of brakes outside, a little yelp, and we ran down, and just outside our little apartment was a kind of tiny little white puppy. And we kind of nursed him back to health, couldn't find his owner. And so he grew up in our little house, although we didn't know if we were allowed to have a puppy. And so whenever the landlord used to come around for an inspection, we used to kind of stick the puppy in a wardrobe with a bowl of milk, keep it safe. And whenever it kind of barked, we used to just kind of cough and hope no one had noticed. Anyway, about 18 months later, we were out, and just my wife and I, and our landlord came up to us and said, well, how's the dog? And we go, what dog? Well, the dog we knew you kept in your house. I think Saul had a similar experience. He couldn't pull one over on Samuel. Samuel's a prophet sent from God. And, this bleating of sheep has exposed Saul's duplicity. And this is going to kick off now. Saul answered, well, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle. This is verse 15. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. Another lie. They kept them for themselves. This wasn't about an offering to God. God has told them what he wanted. And Samuel just goes, stop. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Enough of your rubbish. Let me just tell you it as it is. Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? As we said at the beginning of Saul's leadership, he felt himself unworthy to lead. And that was a really brilliant posture for him to take as a leader. He was a humble leader. I'm not ready to do this. I can't do this. And God was with him saying, I'll help you. So Samuel reminds Saul of his initial humility. And God sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people of the Amalekites. Make war on them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of which was devoted to God in order to sacrifice them to the Lord, your God, at Gilgal. But Samuel replied, and these verses get repeated in the Psalms later on. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. That concept that you can offer God a kind of ritual. You could turn up at church, sing your songs, say your prayers, read the Bible every day, have your kind of disciplines. That is no substitute for the obedience to God, actually seeking what God wants. It isn't a case of if you just do a few rituals and, Hail Marys or prayers or whatever, then you could do whatever you want. What God wants is not the ritual, but a genuine relationship. And any attempt we have to kind of swap out the ritual for the relationship is always going to fall short. What Saul seemed to think he could do is, well, as long as I offer a few sacrifices, I can keep the rest of the plunder to myself. And he was kind of trading with God. And that is super dangerous. And I feel that all the time. There are things that I do and I think, oh, no, I shouldn't do that. But maybe I can offset it by doing this, as if there was some kind of deal to be made. God says, no, to obey is better than sacrifice. We need somehow to learn to put God first. I feel like I'm master at this. This talk today is called How to Fail as a Leader, and I could give you countless examples of ways that I've failed. I'm hearing this challenge from the scriptures speaking to my heart as I share them with you. So this isn't someone coming from a position of expertise or brilliance. This is someone who's equally being challenged here. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instruction. I was afraid of the people, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. In the end, Saul seems to fail obeying God because he's more worried about other people's opinion. He was scared of people, and therefore he didn't fear God. I tell you, if you had to fear someone, either fear God or fear people, who should you fear? The Bible's really clear. We should fear God first. God is the one that we should be most worried about in terms of pleasing and making sure we're prioritizing. And we often get it wrong. We play to the crowd, we play to the adulation, the followers, the hits, the platforms, and we're often more willing to please people than we are to please God. And Samuel says that's the complete upside down way of living as a leader. And it's going to fail you because you're going to lose both in the end. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe and it tore. Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbours, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind." God is not a man that he should change his mind. God makes his mind up and then sticks to it. That's what's being said here. But hold on, didn't God have remorse about and regret about appointing Saul? How do you put those two things together? God doesn't change his mind, but he seems to have changed his mind about Saul. That's a difficult one to reconcile, because that's how it could appear to Saul. Well, one moment you were with me, God, now you're not. How do I reconcile that with a God who doesn't change his mind? I think it was always given to the people of Israel as a challenge, and I believe indeed to Saul, that they showed their allegiance to God by obedience. And so the rules haven't changed, but Saul changed. And Saul disqualified himself from leadership. And therefore God is having to take the actions that come with that. And that fits to me the picture of a God who loves the world. God loved Saul. He genuinely wanted him to succeed. But he gave Saul the room to reject him and to rebel against him. And Saul sadly took that opportunity and has therefore disqualified himself from leading Israel. Anyway, then something pretty brutal happens. Samuel asks for Agag to be brought to him, and in verse 33 Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so your mother will be childless among women." There does seem to be a lot of execution and judgment happening in some of these passages we've been reading, and some of them come with poetry. You remember the story of Jael that was immortalised in song by Deborah. Well, here's another song, and it's a justice song. This King Agag had been a really brutal tyrant and had killed many, many people, including children. And now God is going to exact judgment on him. "The sword that has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women." And so Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up into his house in Gibeah. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. Now the stage is set for a new king. Tomorrow we're going to look at the kind of king that God wants to install, a man after his own heart. But I think we need to pause a minute at this failed picture of leadership that we see in Saul. And there are things, I think, to learn. I think there are three issues here. One is Saul moved from being a man of humility to a man of arrogance. He felt he could do whatever he wanted. Remember, there was a time when Saul decided he couldn't be bothered to wait for Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice. He said, I can do it. Well, that wasn't what God had said. And so he kind of had an inflated view of himself, and that led to all sorts of problems. So he was a man of arrogance. He was also a man of cowardice, which is odd, isn't it? He was very arrogant about his own ability, and yet he was cowardly when it came to leading people and asking them to do things that God had asked them to do rather than what they wanted to do. And that cowardice was a problem. And thirdly, that led to disobedience. So rather than obeying what God wanted, Saul went with the flow of the people. And that's those three things: arrogance, disobedience, and cowardice. They're toxic. And I know that in my